What's going on, everybody? Cleopus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be revisiting the BLU Bold N2 and going over whether or not it's still a good phone to buy in 2023. Now, as always, if you do end up wanting to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description, where we'll be linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the BLU Bold N2, we're getting a 6.6-inch AMOLED display with a 1080p resolution, a PPI of 390, and a 19.5:9 aspect ratio. Now in general, I feel like out of all the phones BLU has, the Bold N2 definitely has the best display here, despite having a kind of mediocre aspect ratio at 19.5:9. The form factor isn't bad, but it's not quite as tall and narrow as most phones nowadays. I want to say the average is like 20:9, and some of the more exceptional ones have 20.5:9. In general, it probably doesn't matter too much, because despite maybe not being the best in the world, you're still going to get a really immersive, nice experience in landscape mode, especially considering the bezels are so thin, and the notch for the front-facing camera really doesn't take up much space. So yeah, overall, even though the form factor isn't really ideal in my opinion, things definitely are going to look good. And aside from the form factor, everything else about the display here is really good. At 6.6 inches, on one hand, it's not the largest phone in the world, but at the same time, it's definitely large enough to give you a good experience when you're doing pretty much anything on it. And at the same time, it's still decently compact, so it's not going to be too bulky or uncomfortable to hold or anything like that. In addition to this, with a 1080p resolution, we got a really nice looking sharp image here. So of course, if you're doing stuff like watching videos, where the image quality is a bit more important, that's definitely going to be a good thing. And with an AMOLED display, that's another more unique thing about this phone, especially for the price range, because there are phones that are double the price of this one, like the Motorola Moto G Stylus 5G for example, that still don't have an AMOLED display. And with an AMOLED, first of all, the colors are going to look a little bit nicer and more vivid. So again, going back to stuff like watching videos, maybe playing games, where the image quality is really important, and AMOLED is definitely going to help with that. And in addition to this, if you're maybe outside in the sun, for example, or in a really bright room, in that kind of situation with a typical LCD type display, the viewing angles tend to not be the best, making the phone a bit harder to see. But with the BLU Bold N2, having an AMOLED display, the viewing angles are great. So again, if you're outside in the sun, for example, compared to the average phone in this price range, it is going to be quite a bit easier to see. So in general, if you are looking for an affordable 5G phone that has a really good display, then this phone is going to be a great choice. Now for storage, the BLU Bold N2 is getting 256 gigabytes of internal storage, but there's no microSD card expansion here. Now I kind of have mixed feelings about this, because on one hand, pretty much every phone in this price range is going to have microSD card expansion, as it should be. I mean, it's a common feature, and I know having microSD card expansion is important for a lot of people. That being said though, with an entire 256 gigabytes, you're probably not going to fill this up unless you're downloading a bunch of different apps, in which case, at that point, I don't even know if a microSD card would help you. So the point is, on one hand, it is kind of too bad this phone doesn't have microSD card expansion, but at the same time, with 256 gigabytes of internal storage, unless you're getting an older flagship phone or something like that, in this price range, there are really not very many phones that have this much. So in general, because of this, I do think the storage is still good, but if you really do want microSD card expansion, then again, keep in mind, this phone doesn't have it. For security features, this phone does have Face Unlock and a fingerprint scanner, so definitely nice to get both options here. But let's go ahead and give the fingerprint scanner a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see, not only does it look real nice and premium, but it's also real fast and responsive. No issues at all. And again, if you want to use Face Unlock instead, you always can. Now, taking a look at the camera setup here with the BLU Bold N2, I don't know if this is technically a hole punch or an island or whatever you want to call it, but it does look really nice, kind of like the Samsung Galaxy S10. It really has that kind of vibe to it. But this camera is 16 megapixels, and like I was saying before, it really doesn't take up a whole lot of space on the screen. So if you're watching a video in landscape mode and you want to go in like full screen mode or something, you're not going to have to worry about it getting in the way like you would with a water drop notch or something like that. So I definitely think that is cool. Then on the back, we got a quad camera setup with a 64 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra wide camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So in general, when it comes to camera features, the BLU Bold N2 has pretty much everything. So if you are someone who likes to take a lot of pictures, and maybe you want a wider variety of features, then this phone is going to be a great choice for you. And aside from just having the features, the photos it takes are really good. So if image quality is important to you, then again, great choice for that too. Now to give you an idea of what it can do, here's some pictures taken with the BLU Bold N2. And again, I definitely do think they came out real nice. This really just goes to show that if you want to take nice pictures, nowadays, you definitely don't have to spend $1,000 on a flagship phone, or even $500 for that matter. You can simply get a $249 phone. And for that average user, I feel like these pictures are going to be plenty good enough for pretty much anything you might be using your camera for. Say you're posting pictures on social media, for example, compared to something like an iPhone 14 or a Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra. Sure, those flagship phones are going to be better, But on something like social media, most people are probably not going to be sitting there thinking about the differences anyway. So overall, if you do like to take nice pictures, but you're still not overly concerned about having studio quality or anything like that, then I do think the Blue Bold N2 is going to be perfectly fine for you. Now for video, this phone has a max recording quality of 2K in the rear camera and 1080p in the front. And while 2K is not really that useful, I guess, since after all it's not 4K, just keep in mind if you do want to record in a slightly higher quality than 1080p, things are going to look a little bit nicer, I guess. And I feel like the vast majority of phones that can't record 4K videos do max out at 1080p. So since the Blue Bold N2 can record 2K videos in at least the rear camera, it does give it a bit of an advantage. Now when it comes to RAM and processor, the Blue Bold N2 is getting 8GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 810 processor. So in general, the performance here is definitely good. Sure, it's not going to be crazy fast or anything, and honestly, even compared to most other phones in this price range, it's about average. I mean, something like the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G, A23 5G, and pretty much every 5G Motorola phone I've seen, and honestly, really any other 5G phone in this price range you can think of, they all are going to be about the same when it comes to processing power and stuff like that. So if you're using a phone for more basic activities and more moderate use, maybe you're going to be browsing the web a lot, scrolling through social media, watching videos, whether it's on YouTube or a streaming platform, and then playing some games here and there. No matter what you're doing, for most people, you are going to get a pretty good experience on this phone. So for what it's meant for, despite not being really significantly faster or slower than any other phone in this price range, performance-wise, in my experience using it, the Blue Bold N2 is definitely good enough. And again, despite not having 5G in the name, the Blue Bold N2 is in fact a 5G phone. So if you are looking for 5G connectivity, then here you go. Now I did run a benchmark test on this phone using Geekbench 5. And here are the results I got. So what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and then comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of whether or not this phone's going to be a performance upgrade for you. Because depending on what you're coming from, it may or may not be. I mean, if you're coming from an older flagship phone like a Samsung Galaxy S10 for example, then it's definitely not going to be an upgrade. But if you're coming from like a Samsung Galaxy A13 or any number of entry-level devices for that matter, then there is a pretty good chance that this phone will be a solid performance upgrade. But in general, again, I feel like for most people, for things everyone typically uses smartphones for, you're really not going to go wrong with this phone. Now for the battery, the Blue Bold N2 has a 4200 mAh battery that supports 30 watt fast charging, so definitely not a bad battery here. Sure, on one hand, if you really want the best battery life you can get for the money, then compared to something like almost every other 5G phone in this price range, you can do better because most phones nowadays do have 5000 mAh batteries. At this point in 2023, it's definitely pretty common. But that being said, in my experience, despite not having the absolute best battery life, with the Blue Bold N2, it is pretty good. So if you just need a decent battery that works, and you're not too concerned about maximizing battery life, maybe you plug your phone in most of the time anyway, then in that case, the Blue Bold N2 is still going to be perfectly fine. And with 30 watt fast charging, the charging speed is definitely really good, and it does actually come with a fast charger. So if you do want to take full advantage of the charging speeds, you can do that even if you don't have a fast charger already. But I do want to point out that this phone does not have wireless charging, and the reason I say that is not exactly because I expected it in a phone like this, but because the Blue F91 5G, which is in some ways pretty similar to this phone, does actually have wireless charging. And while of course they look nothing alike, so I seriously doubt anyone's going to be confusing these two, just in case you saw or heard about the F91 5G before this phone and you're expecting every 5G Blue phone to have wireless charging, then keep in mind, unfortunately again, this phone does not have that feature. Now when it comes to software, with the Blue Bold N2, we are getting Android 11, which is kind of too bad at this point, because in 2023, we are on Android 13. And while at this point, most entry-level to mid-range phones don't have Android 13 yet for some reason, unless you get a Samsung, I would at least expect this phone to have an update to Android 12, but unfortunately, that hasn't happened yet. I actually just updated this phone today, so at least it has the January security update. But as you can see, again, it only has Android 11, so if the software is more important to you, then you're probably not going to want this phone. Another kind of disappointing thing here is that with the Blue Bold N2, this phone does not have NFC, which in 2023 is definitely more of an expectation, especially for a 5G phone that's close to $300. I want to say the vast majority of phones like this do have NFC, and since the feature is becoming more and more popular and widely used, I mean, in the US at least, how many times do you walk into a store nowadays and not get some sort of tap and pay option? I mean, there are stores out there obviously, but I want to say the vast majority of places nowadays are using tap and pay, and while obviously that doesn't mean every person is, it is always nice to have that option, but unfortunately again with the Blue Bold N2, since it doesn't have NFC, we don't get that option. So if you do like to use tap and pay, then you're probably going to want to skip this phone. Now taking a look at the overall design, definitely unique, especially for a phone like this. It is really slim, so if you like that kind of sleek modern feel, then you are really going to like this phone. And when it comes to the materials, for what it is, it does feel really premium. The back has this kind of leathery material, and the sides I believe are aluminum, at least they feel like it. So in general, definitely really well made. The buttons are solid, the build quality is good, and the phone does have a good amount of weight to it. But in addition to this, it does also come with a case, so if you do like to use cases on your phone, phone, then that's definitely a nice thing. That being said though, design-wise, one kind of disappointing thing here is that the Blue Bolt N2 doesn't have a headphone jack. It only has a USB-C port that you use as a headphone jack, and while it does come with an adapter at least, if you like to use wired headphones, it still is going to be a little inconvenient. So if that is important to you, then definitely keep this in mind. But in conclusion, is the Blue Bolt N2 still worth buying in 2023? In general, I want to say yes, but there are definitely some things to consider here. First of all, again, no headphone jack. I mean, it's not really that uncommon. Most of the higher end Samsung Galaxy A series phones don't have headphone jacks either, so it is really a feature that's going away. But this phone also has Android 11, which I guess it's not the end of the world, especially if you don't really care about the software. But I mean, we're on Android 13 now. It is 2023, and it would have been really nice if Blue had better software support. So again, if you do care about the software, you're probably not going to want this phone because as time goes on, it's becoming more and more outdated. So definitely keep this in mind. It also is too bad that it doesn't have microSD card expansion. Granted, it does have 256 gigabytes of internal storage. So I feel like for most people, a microSD card isn't really necessary. But maybe your current phone does have a microSD card and you have all your important stuff on that microSD card, then transferring all that onto the internal storage of this phone is probably going to be a pain. So that is also worth considering. And again, probably one of the biggest issues I have with this phone is that it doesn't have NFC. I don't want to say it's a deal breaker for me because I guess I can live without tap and pay, but I use it so often and so does everyone I know. So seeing a phone like this in 2023 that doesn't have NFC, especially considering again it's almost $300, and while you can probably find some good deals on it now, it's still worth considering that for pretty much everything I've talked about here, you can find another phone for around the same price that has all the things this phone doesn't. That being said though, if you are looking for an affordable 5G phone that has a really nice display, a ton of internal storage, and a really nice camera, then in general, the Blue Bolt N2 is still at least worth considering, especially since again, it does have a really nice unique design. But if you really want to maximize the value you're going to get for the money, then honestly at this point in 2023, I do think you can do better. Now once again, if you do want to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description where we'll be linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.